So there's a story I heard from Rabbi Manis Friedman. You've heard Rabbi Manis before. He's been to these JLI retreats. He's invited many, many years ago. He lives in Minnesota. He's invited to speak to a group of college kids on the subject of marriage. And he's led many weekends in Chabad at the subject of marriage, many marriage encounters. So when they wanted a rabbi at the University of Minnesota, they naturally asked him to come. Now, this is back in the 70s, and he's thinking to himself, I'm going to speak on a college campus. I'm going to come in with this long beard. I'm going to talk to college kids about marriage. They're not going to accept anything from me. I don't feel, they don't look at me as if I'm one of them, that I understand what they're going through. I won't connect to my audience. So he decided he was going to try something different at this particular talk. He was going to dress differently. If you remember the 70s, Henry Winkler was quite famous in the 70s for playing the role of the Fonz on Happy Days. So Rabbi Friedman comes in with a leather jacket, the Fonz jacket. Now, when he walks into the seminar room, that is the first time that he figured something else out. He wasn't just invited himself to this seminar on marriage, but he was part of a 3 clergy member panel. There was a minister, there was a priest, and there was a rabbi dressed as the Fonz. Now these other 2 guys, they come dressed in full robe, with all of the garments, and here is the Hasidic rabbi looking very different than you would expect a Hasidic rabbi to look. And he was to go third. The father and the minister each go, and they talk about marriage and being faithful to your spouse and adultery and hell and everything else that goes on. And then it was his turn. Well, he figured he already has the leather jacket on. He might as well continue the role play. And so he opens with the following line: marriage makes no sense at all. Why get married, kids? Don't do it. Why trap yourself and remain with only one person your entire life? Does that make any sense? It's a strange institution. I suggest that you all be free. Live with one woman until you're tired of her. You live with one guy until you're tired of him. And then you pick someone else and just keep trading them around. That's freedom of life. Makes more sense. Now the minister and the priest are going crazy. They're seeing this Hasidic rabbi, and they're very, very uncomfortable with what they're hearing. But the students are very comfortable. They're about to give this guy a standing ovation. They love it. And just when they're about to scream and yell, he adds, "But God asked us to get married." And then not only did he defend the institution of marriage, but he gave it a whole new light. It's a godly institution. It's a godly understanding of what a relationship is supposed to be about. Marriage is a godly institution. It's not a man-made institution that we're going to try to use our logics to say, is it good, is it not good? It's the system that God set up in creation for the human being. This is his world, his master plan. We're his creations, and this is his instruction manual. The Torah tells us it's not good for man to be alone. I will make him a match corresponding to him. Therefore, man shall leave his father and his mother and cling to his wife, and I quote to you now from the book of Genesis, and they shall become one flesh. V'hayu lebasar echad. They shall become one flesh. Not a man-made concept. God's building block of civilization. Now, he could have created a world which would have had a free-for-all. He did that in the animal world. The animals don't have a chuppah and don't get married. They don't need a get. They don't need a divorce. There's no marriage that you have 2 dogs or cats getting married. There's no romance. It's just instinct. There's no true loyalty. They live together until for some reason they find other partners. Now, man also has this animal instinct. And man also has impulses. And man also has reactions. But God chose, in order for this world to become a godly world, that there needs to be a system of marriage and family. And he asks us to choose not to follow our basic animal instinct, but to follow another instinct that he has planted within man. And that's the godly instinct. To raise ourselves above the animal and to be a godly human. And that's our purpose. Now, statistics will back up that when the institution of marriage is broken down, all sacred institutions in society break down. There becomes a free-for-all in all aspects of society. There's no values being passed on from one generation to the next, to the children and grandchildren of one generation, and therefore everything becomes weakened and everything becomes damaged. I quote to you again, because it's important to remember the words from the book of Genesis. It is not good for man to be alone. I will make him a match corresponding to him. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and cling to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. What's this one flesh? What does it mean? Biblical terms, one flesh. So there's many commentaries on what it means. V'hayu lebasar echad, they shall be one flesh. Some try to explain the meaning of the words as a poetic way of saying that their love should be so great for one another. But if it was poetry that God was trying to give forth with the words, shouldn't have he said one heart? Wouldn't one heart, v'hayu, that should be one heart between them? One mind between them? One soul would be more appropriate. In fact, that which Kabbalah teaches us is indeed correct, that we are one soul. That man and wife are really two halves of a soul sent into this world at different times, at different places, only to find themselves with some magnetic draw of one soul to complete its own soul. And really, marriage is the combination of two halves of a soul that now bring it back together to whole. And that's what the Kabbalah teaches us. Just like you lost something you once had, you search for it. You were attached to another part of a soul, and in the process of creation, we got separated. So we feel lonely until we find the other half of our soul, and that's what marriage represents. So why wouldn't the verse say, they shall be one soul? Why lebasar echad? On a side note, one of the leaders in Israel today is a man you may have remembered from our recent history named Natan Sharansky. Natan Sharansky is a magnificent story, and if anyone hasn't read his books, I strongly recommend you read Sharansky's books. A very, very special human being. He lived in the Soviet Union. He wanted to immigrate to Israel. And for this crime of asking to immigrate to Israel, he was accused of being an American spy. He was brought to trial, and when asked if he wanted to say anything in his own defense, anyone remember what he said at this trial? He stood up. This is the time where everyone would beg and plead this so-called judge for mercy. Natan Sharansky stood up and said, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem, and he sat down. This was Natan Sharansky. He was sent to Siberia. Anatoly Sharansky got married the same day that he was arrested. In fact, the communists wanted to really hurt this man, so they knew he was getting married. They waited for him to get married, and right after the ceremony was over, that's when they took him away. This is the epitome of evil. They never allowed him to be intimate with his wife. He married her, and he was dragged away. They didn't spend a single night together as husband and wife. And yet for 9 years that they were apart, this woman refused to be silent. For 9 years, this courageous woman, she met with every politician in the world. She led demonstrations and petition drives. She met with presidents of the United States. President Reagan writes about Mrs. Sharansky, about one time going to a summit with Gorbachev, and they're driving in a limousine, and Mrs. Sharansky is standing all alone on a street corner with a sign saying, "Free my husband." It seemed to have been some coordination with the White House staff at telling her exactly where they would want her to stand. And President Reagan has his limousine slow down, stopping right at the corner where Mrs. Sharansky is standing with her little sign. And President Reagan turns to Gorbachev and says, so long as that woman still has to stand on street corners asking for the freedom of her husband, there will never be peace between our two countries. And a week later, Sharansky was given the notice that he was going to be released. Now, the interesting part about this story, about this fascinating couple, is that during these 9 years that she was separated from him, she became a returnee to Judaism. He was a secular Jew. She became totally observant. So not only does he come out after 9 years with a woman that he's married to but has never been intimate with, but he's coming to a woman that now lives by a totally different standard. She keeps Shabbos, she keeps kosher, she covers her hair, and yet the two overcame all differences, and they learned to function as husband and wife. And when she's asked, how do you do it? She said, very simple, we're one soul. We've always been one soul. I've been waiting for the rest of my soul to be complete all these years. So I understand the one soul comment. It makes sense, and Kabbalah will back that up. But that's not what the biblical text says. The biblical text says one flesh. So others try to explain that what does it mean, one flesh, that when man and woman will get together, this union will bring about a child. And that child will be one flesh that came forth of this union of the man and his wife. And that would be the meaning of the word one flesh. The problem with that, however, is why wouldn't the verse just say it? And the man and the woman should get together and produce a child. In fact, the very next verse says just that. You will be fruitful and multiply, and you'll bring children into the world. So the text says it the next verse. So it couldn't mean this in the original verse of one flesh. So clearly this verse of one flesh means something more than having children, which parenthetically clarifies about the holiness of marriage is not just because they will produce children, but that there's an inherent holiness to marriage itself. And thus a couple who cannot have children, or a couple who's past the age of having children, are still fulfilling this mitzvah of marriage, still creating a sanctity to their marriage. So back to our original question, what is one flesh? It is what a good marriage is meant to be. That not only are they joined by the soul, not only are they joined by intimacy, but they're also joined by the needs and the concerns of the body. That a wife's physical needs becomes the needs of her husband. That her personality and her ego and her habits and her hang-ups become part of your life. They're not two individuals, they're one. There's a beautiful tradition at a chuppah. You may have seen it if you've gone to a traditional wedding. Right before the chuppah, there's something called the badekin. What's the badekin? The groom comes over to the bride. In many circles, he hasn't seen her for the entire week leading up to the wedding. And at this very powerful, emotional moment, he takes a veil and he covers the bride's face right before the chuppah, and she is brought to the chuppah with this veil on. And in traditional circles, this veil is opaque. She can't actually see anything through it. It's not just a see-through veil, but she actually does need to be led to the chuppah because she can't see anything at all. Now, what's the reference to this? Where's the source of this tradition? We find two references in the Bible. There's a reference that when Rebekah was coming to meet Isaac for the first time, the Torah says she covered her face with a veil. And then we know another interesting marriage told to us in the stories of the Bible, a story about Jacob's marriage. Anyone remember that marriage? Jacob works for 7 years for Rachel, who he loves so much, and this father-in-law of his switches that night, and lo and behold, it wasn't Rachel under the chuppah, it was Rachel's sister Leah. But Jacob didn't know it because she was covered with a veil. So my question is, why would we repeat this then? I mean, Jacob wakes up in the morning and he looks, and lo and behold, it's Leah. Where's Rachel? Oh no, my father-in-law fooled me. And he ends up marrying Rachel as well. He ends up marrying Bilhah, and he ends up marrying Zilpah. But still, why would we try to emulate a tradition based on something he was fooled? So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to put a veil on the woman and then bring her to the chuppah so the guy doesn't know who he's marrying? What's this tradition all about? You see, Rachel was the wife that Jacob chose. Leah was the wife of fate that destiny had in mind for Jacob. And he needed to marry both. When we get married, there's a woman that we chose to marry, the Rachel woman, the one we dated, the one we fell in love with, the one we think we know, the one we're attracted to, the choice wife. But at the very same time that we're marrying that Rachel woman, we also marry the Leah woman as well. She's the woman within that same woman that we don't know. The Leah aspect of our wife that's not revealed yet, that we'll only find out about later. At our chuppah, we bear in mind that we're marrying both the woman we know, and we're also committing ourselves to love and to care for the woman, the personality that will emerge at times that I'm not familiar with. There is also the symbolism of the circle. The bride circles the groom places a ring on her finger. Each one's life will encircle and be encircled by the other. And so we say, it's very nice, but it's impossible. I can understand you want me to love her. I can understand you want me to take care of her. I can understand you want me to be intimate with her. I got no problem with that. I can even understand the spiritual stuff where one soul, all of that makes sense. It's basher, two souls need to come together. But how do you expect a person to become one? And that's the words of the Bible, to become one in aspects of physical needs, or as we would call them, mishigasin. If she's got crazy things or he's got crazy things, you want me to be one with it? It should say, be tolerant of it. Put up with it. But be one with it? Why should I be one with it? And God gives us the answer in the book of Genesis. It's right there. What does he say? He says, man was created in the image of God. What is he saying to us? He's saying, hey, I put up with so many of your mishigasin. I put up with so much of your craziness. And I'm still one with you. If I can do it, you can do it. And this is why shalom bayis, peace in a home, is so critical. The more we become one with our spouse, the more God becomes one with us. They mirror one another. If the Torah is making this statement so early on in the book of Genesis, in the story of our creation, it's to tell us that marriage is the institution upon which all else will be built. This is how the story of the family begins, because the entire book of Genesis is about the family. The more a couple realizes that they have entered into a holy bond, a godly bond, the more they realize how much effort they have to put into making the marriage work. And we all know that marriage takes work, takes effort, takes thoughtfulness, it takes sensitivity. It's written that bringing peace between man and his wife is beyond reward in this world, with the bulk of the reward reserved for the afterlife. Bringing peace between them when they're distant are from the greatest mitzvot in the Torah. So much so that the Torah cannot define its reward in this world. A man once came to the Rebbe and he said that I heard of some tradition that it's a good omen for shalom bayis, for peace in the home, if the moment Shabbat is over, the man folds his talis. You ever hear about that? You may have seen it in some circles, that the moment Shabbos is over, men run to fold their talis. It's brought down by some strange tradition that if you fold your talis right after Shabbos, it brings blessing to peace in the home. That's what's mentioned. So someone asked the Lubavitcher Rebbe this question: is there any truth to this, or is it, as we call, a Baba Maisa? Someone made this up and it got passed along. What's the story behind this tradition? The Rebbe's answer: it might be true. I'm not sure, but I have a better idea for you for Shalom Bayis. If you want peace in the home, take my advice. The moment Shabbos is over, go home and wash the dishes. You want a good omen for bringing peace in the house? You want to fold your talis? You can fold your talis. You want to wash your dishes? Now that will bring blessings into the home. My father was a holy-looking Jew. He had a white beard, a sagely look. He was a Torah scholar. And yet, if you were ever in my house immediately after Shabbos, there was my father at the kitchen sink cleaning all the dishes. The cholent pot, scraping it, the countertops. We, the kids, would come in, we would dry the dishes, but my father would not give up that job of standing by the kitchen sink right after Shabbos was over to clean all the dishes. He didn't ask us to do it. He wanted to do it himself. And he did that for some 60 years. That's over 2,500 Shabbosim that he wouldn't give up that task of standing by the kitchen sink to clean the dishes after Shabbos, because to him it was precious. He didn't do it grudgingly. And the entire time that my father would be standing at the kitchen sink, he would be singing Hasidic melodies the entire time. Because for him, this was serving God too. You serve God in prayer, wearing that talis, and you serve God by bringing peace into the home, by helping out in the house. There are many challenges in life. We face challenges every single day, but perhaps the greatest challenge we face is our behavior in our home. People that are the most patient people in the world outside can't seem to show any patience inside the home. And the Torah understood the struggle and reserved these blessings for those who make Shalom Bayis their priority. There's a joke told about a student who didn't excel in anything. He just wasn't good at anything. But he once heard that there's a lofty place reserved in heaven for those who are married to what you would call in Yiddish terminology a shlach. It's hard to give a explanation of the word. A very nasty woman, a mean woman, a woman who never has anything nice to say, a woman who's made her husband miserable every day of his life. Okay? You get the picture? Shlach. So he hears that if someone was married to a shlach and he tolerates it all his life, when he dies after 120 years, there's a special place reserved for him in the lofty adobes up in heaven. So he thinks to himself, a scholar I'm not, a holy person I'm not, a great person I'm not. I'm never getting to heaven on my own deeds. This is my ticket. This is my way in. So he goes to the shadchan. You know what a shadchan is? Matchmaker, matchmaker. He goes to the matchmaker and he says, matchmaker, make me a match, but I only want a shlach. I want the worst girl you got on the list. I want the girl that no one will get near, that no one would date. I want the meanest, most bitter girl you got. And the shadchan says, I don't get you. Why? You're a nice guy. Don't ask me questions. This is what I want. Says, you know, I do have a girl that people have gone out with. They go out and after 5 minutes they run away from her. I've heard the worst things in the world about this girl, and I can't get her a date at all. So if you want, I'll set you up with her. Perfect! That's the girl of my dreams. He goes out and within 5 minutes he proposes marriage. Will you marry me? She says yes. And they get married. And he's waiting for the abuse to start. He's waiting to hear about it. Oh, is he, come on, pour it on. I'm going to heaven. He's so happy at his wedding. I got my ticket to heaven. I'm going to heaven. Come home after the wedding. She's the sweetest girl in the world to him. My dear husband, what can I do to make you happy? And she's just so nice. I think maybe it's the first night. Tomorrow morning, she's going to let me have it. The next morning, my dear sweet husband, what can I cook you for breakfast? Everything, my dear sweet husband, my dear sweet husband. He doesn't understand what's going on. Maybe the first week, the week of Sheva Bracha, sooner or later, the abuse is going to come out. This is a schlock. A week goes by, 2 weeks go by, a month goes by. She's the nicest person in the world. He's going crazy. He's so upset. He lost his place in heaven. What's going on? He goes to the matchmaker. What did you do to me? She's the sweetest girl in the world. I asked you for a schlock. What'd you give me here? And he's saying, I'm telling you what everyone said about her. I don't understand. But maybe it'll start soon. He waits a second month, a third month, nothing doing. The most beautiful girl, the nicest person, everything sweet and nice, and he is as depressed as they can be. He comes back 6 months later to the matchmaker. What did you do? It's been 6 months, not one mean word yet. The matchmaker can't figure this out. So he himself can't get to the bottom of this. So he calls her up and he says, could you come see me? And he says, I don't understand this community. Why were there so many rumors about you? You're the nicest person in the world, and yet I heard such bad things. This community is so filled with gossip that they can say such terrible things about you. And the girl looks at him and says, what do you think, I'm stupid? You think I didn't figure out why that guy wanted to marry me? He wanted to marry a schlock because he wanted to get into heaven. I will not give him one schlocky day in his life. He will go to hell. On a more serious note, there's a great reward to those who hold themselves back from firing each time your spouse says something that upsets you. This doesn't mean that you should marry someone for this purpose. There is no truth to the idea of the schlock going to heaven. And it doesn't mean we should make ourselves into shmatas, into rags. But there's a quality and a self-control and possibly a positive self-esteem. You don't need to win the argument every time. You don't need to get that best zinger in. You don't need to always have the last word. Maimonides writes that one of the most important qualities and attributes to have in life is to be, and get used to this Hebrew word, to be a mevater. Mevater. Today, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like for everyone to become familiar not just with the word, but with what it means. I don't know if there's a precise English translation, but it basically means to overlook, to forego, to take that step back, to step aside and defer to the other person. A mevater is someone who has a forbeing personality, someone who lets things slide, even if he or she thinks they have a legitimate claim to their point of view. A colleague of mine tells me that before he performs a marriage ceremony, he meets with the young couple, and one of the questions he says is, do you guys want to be right or do you want to be happy? Which one? Because they don't always go hand in hand. It may very well be that you're right all of the time, most of the time. You know where it's at, and you know the truth, and you know what's best. And since you know it more than your spouse, it ought to always go your way. You know, the famous question, what are the three most important words in a marriage? So you have different opinions out there. The romantics will tell you, of course, it's the three words, I love you. The cynics and the comedians will say it's yes, my dear. But the pragmatics will tell you that the three most important words in a marriage is I was wrong. Is the ability to take a step back and to be honest and say, I may not always be right. That's to be a mevater. Because, my friends, whatever the issue may be, there's hardly anything that could be more important in our lives than maintaining that shalom bayis, that peace and tranquility in our homes. The Talmud poses an interesting question. The Talmud asks the following: what is the law if somebody can only afford to buy one candle, and it's a Friday night, and it happens to be Hanukkah? You can only afford one candle. Which candle do you buy? The Hanukkah candle or the Shabbos candle? Now, for us, we're saying, come on, how could you only afford one candle? But back in the times of the Talmud, people didn't have money. And that was the question of the Talmud. And the Talmud states unequivocally that one is obligated to buy the Shabbos candle. Why? Because aside from the mitzvah itself, the Shabbos candle promotes and symbolizes the tranquility and the peace in the home. And that takes precedence over everything else. This fellow once said to his rabbi, I used to argue with my wife all the time. But then one day I realized I didn't like to lose an argument because I didn't want to be a loser. On the other hand, if I won the argument, that would mean that my wife lost the argument. And I don't want to be married to a loser. If you're married to a loser, what does that make you? So the only solution is to stop arguing. The point is that in a marriage, there's no winner versus loser. You're in it together. No two human beings are alike, especially not when you're dealing with the opposite sex. We all know that. We have different wants and different needs, and very often one person's wants and needs encroach on another person's wants and needs. This happens in everyone's home. It happens in every shul. The women complain it's too cold. The men complain it's too hot. The women want it at 72 degrees. The men want it at 68 degrees. I have this war every year on the high holidays. The men's side are complaining it's too hot. The women says it's freezing here. It's Siberia here. I'm waiting for some airlines that goes out of business that want to sell me their blankets so I can pass around American Airlines blankets on the women's side. She says, you never have time for anything, but when it comes to watching the football game, you seem to always have the time you need for the football game. And he complains about how come every single departure takes an extra hour. We're ready to leave on time. We're going to be ready to leave on time. Oh, yeah, sure. How many men do you always see by the wedding hall waiting to leave by the door, jingling their keys because their wife says we're ready to go, and they're standing there because they believed that they're ready to go? We all have this conference at the door. We're ready to go. We're ready to go. But this is life. We get used to it. We all have our mishigasin. We all have our pet peeves. So how do we do it? How do we possibly live with each other when we're such different creatures? The answer is to understand that these very difficulties that present not only the challenge, but the beauty of marriage. First and foremost, you need to communicate in an open and gentle manner. You need to spend that quality time together, not just once a week or once a year, but all year round. Like Henny Youngman said, my wife and I have a secret to making a marriage last. 2 times a week we go to a nice restaurant. A little wine, good food, pleasant ambiance. She goes on Tuesday, I go on Thursday. No, that's not what I mean. That was just a joke. Best would be is if you go with each other. We have to learn to introduce that mevater into our lives, to make space. Giving in a marriage is not an outgrowth of love for your spouse. It's the only way. Love is an outgrowth of giving. Giving is what creates and builds that love in the relationship. The true joys of a healthy marriage do not come from that which you receive from your spouse, but from that which you give to a spouse. The story of the Chafetz Chaim. You've heard his name. He's a great rabbi, lived in the early part of the last century. And once he was traveling and he stayed at a certain city for Shabbos, and while there, he was invited to spend the Friday night dinner by a community member. Now, if you're familiar with the traditional Shabbat table, the 2 challahs are placed on the table, and what goes on top of the challah? There's a challah cover. And you got some nice embroidered ones. Why do we have the challah covered on the Shabbos table? Anyone know the reason? Okay, very good. The reason is because we're going to start this meal. We normally start every meal with the bread, but we're going to start this meal Friday night not with the bread, but with the wine. So we don't want to embarrass the bread. So we cover the bread so the bread shouldn't peek and shouldn't see that you're starting with the wine. Well, it teaches us sensitivity. That's the whole idea, is that we learn sensitivities through inanimate objects. We're not going to make the challah feel bad that we didn't start with it, so we're going to cover the challah, go to the wine, then wash for the bread and uncover the challah. So anyway, getting back to my story, he's at this particular house, and as they're sitting at the table, the man of the household realizes that his wife had forgotten to cover the challah. She forgot to put the challah cover on top of the challah. And here is this very special guest, this rabbi, the Chafetz Chaim. He's sitting at this table, and the challah is not covered, and they're about to make kiddush, and he gets all upset at his wife, and he yells, "You forgot to cover the challah!" And she gets all insulted and all embarrassed and apologetic, and she runs to the kitchen trembling, and she puts the challah cover down, feeling terrible that her husband was so embarrassed in front of the Chafetz Chaim that the challah wasn't covered. He's about to make kiddush, and the Chafetz Chaim says, "I'm sorry, but I have to leave." And he heads for the door. The husband chases after him and says, "I'm sorry, I apologize about my wife. She doesn't think, she doesn't use her head. I'm sorry. I know you're leaving because the challah wasn't covered." And he says, "You think I'm leaving because of your wife? I'm leaving because of you." The whole idea of covering the challah is to show sensitivity to the bread so that we should learn sensitivity to another human being. So what did you do with this? You used the same challah cover to hurt the feelings of your wife, to embarrass her in front of me. It's not your wife that's chasing me away. It's you. It's that insensitivity. We all have flaws. None of us are perfect. Not me, not you. And yet we hope that others will cut us some slack and give us the benefit of the doubt. We hope that others will overlook our flaws. So why don't we do that for others as well? Marriage needs communication, but a healthy marriage also needs silence. Silence at very specific moments. And anyone in this room that is married knows what I'm talking about. Those things that you've said that you regret, that you can't take back. Oh, how you wish you would have been silent right before. Those 3 extra words or that 1 extra sentence because you needed to win that argument and it came out of your mouth and the pain was dealt. It's quoted in Ethics of Our Fathers, "I've spent my life in the presence of great sages and I have found no greater quality of life than the quality of silence." Somebody once said that criticism is a very sharp instrument. When you criticize someone, it can cut as deeply as a surgeon's scalpel. A medical student has to go years and years of training before they're going to allow him to perform surgery. At least we hope they do. You don't want to put a knife in someone's hand to cut someone's open unless they really know what they're doing. And yet we're so quick to cut someone else open with our words, with our mouth. If only we went through the same type of training that a doctor has to go through before cutting someone open, before we cut someone open with the words that we use, especially a spouse. You know, when the wind blows and this tiny speck of dust goes into our eye, you've had that happen, I'm sure. You're miserable. There's this little piece of dust, but it's making you crazy and you can't open your eye and you're tearing up. It's the size of a molecule. It's tiny. And yet, it drives you crazy. Why? Because the eye is a very sensitive place. If that same speck of dust was just on your hand, it would be like this. It would be nothing. If it was on your cheek, it would be nothing. If it was on your head, it would be nothing. But when that speck of dust falls into the eye, which is far more sensitive, it makes you crazy. You never know. You never know that sensitive spot of another human being. You never know what words you say that you think, so what, it's just a few words. How deeply you can hurt somebody by the words that we use. how you can be touching a raw nerve and not even knowing. Every night before we go to sleep, we say the Shema prayer, and we begin with the following introductory paragraph. Master of the universe, I hereby forgive anyone who has angered or provoked me or sinned against me, either physically or financially against my honor or anything else that is mine, whether accidentally or intentionally, inadvertently or deliberately, by speech or by deed. Let me tell you something, if you have the ability to say those words every night and really mean them, you'll have no trouble sleeping at night. The point is that you shouldn't go to sleep on any night with resentment, with anger, with malice weighing upon your heart. And clearly, this takes effort on both parts. It's not a one-way street. It may work in some cases where it's one way, but in most cases you need both parties willing to put in the effort. It takes effort to have that relationship in a marriage. A young unmarried woman was discussing with the Lubavitcher Rebbe some prospective matches that had been suggested to her. And she was saying, this one's no good, and this one's no good. And the Rebbe smiled and said, you've been reading too many romance novels. You know, love is not this overwhelming, blinding emotion we find in the world of fiction. Real love is an emotion that intensifies throughout life. It's the small, everyday acts of being together that makes love flourish. It's sharing, it's caring, it's respecting one another. It's building a family together, building a home. And as two lives unite to form one over time, there is a point where each partner feels they are a part of the other. That's what that verse in Genesis is telling us. When you feel you're one flesh, when one spouse's finger hurts and the other one feels the pain. And all of this takes time. All of this takes effort. To build a home of nachas, you got to put in the effort. There's no shortcut. One day there was an expert on the subject of time management. He was speaking to a group of business students, and he wanted to drive home a point, and he used some illustrations before his students. He had a table on the front of the room, and on this table was this large mason jar. And he has this mason jar and it's empty, and he begins to fill the mason jar up with large bricks until every single brick that he can possibly fill into this mason jar was filled to capacity. And he asks his students the following question: is the jar full? And every student said, sure. And he said, wrong. And he pulls out from under the table a bucket of gravel. And he begins to pour the gravel into the same mason jar, and the gravel is taking up the room in between the large bricks until the gravel is filled to the top of the jar. And then he asks the question, is it full? And the students say, maybe. He takes out a bucket of water, and he begins to pour the water into the mason jar. And the water makes its way in between the gravel, in between the bricks, until the water was overflowing. Is the jar full? They don't know what to answer. He says, yes, the jar is now full. But then he asks the students, what did I just teach you? And one of the students picks up his hand and says, I get it. Even when your day at the office is done, you can always fit in one more job. There's always room for one more business opportunity. And he says, no, not at all. What I just taught you was, if you don't put the large bricks in first, you'll never get them in later. Put the large bricks of life into that mason jar first. Everything else can come later. The large bricks in life is your family, is your marriage, is your home, is your children. Make that the priority of life. The gravel, the water, everything else will come after. But we need to focus on the bricks. Make sure we put those bricks into our lives, into the jar of our lives first. There's so much that competes for our time. It's a busy world. So many choices of what to do with each and every single minute of our lives. We need to stop and think. What are the big rocks? What's really essential to my life? What is the purpose of life itself? And am I focused on that higher purpose? Am I putting the energy into my home and into my family? If we do that and we put those bricks in first, indeed we will find v'hayu lebasar echad, that we become indeed one flesh, one entity, one family. Thank you very much.